Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Lori West, and I'm with the Fargo Public Library, and I am also a member of the One Book, One Community Planning Committee. So, thank you again. This is our 2023 One Book, One Community author presentation featuring Natalie Warren, author of Hudson Bay Bound. This author visit and project is made possible in part with funding from both the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund through the Lake Agassiz Regional Library and the Friends of the Fargo Public Library. If you find these programs bring value to our community, we encourage you to let people know. Tell your friends, tell your librarians, colleagues, and legislators as well. If you would like to help us continue to provide programming similar to this, by the way, it is our 12th year doing this, so thank you for all the support throughout those years. Yeah. So we do ask that you fill out a survey. We have some paper surveys that are located, I think, at 2 tables at the back on either side. There's a QR code also on the program. The website you could go to directly is laurel, LARL.org/legacy survey. Also, if you would like to share a suggestion for next year's title, we definitely are looking for those at this time. And there is a box in the back of the room or maybe out in the larger area there where you can share your suggestions. At the bottom of the program on the back, there's a few blank lines, and you could just put the titles in there. We'd be happy to hear from you. So on behalf of the One Book, One Community Committee, which is comprised of representatives from each of the libraries and university libraries, so public libraries and university libraries in Fargo, Moorhead, and West Fargo, as well as from the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, sorry. I want to thank you for joining us here tonight. Events like these create an amazing sense of community, and that is really our mission, to encourage all of the community members, Fargo, Moorhead, West Fargo, even greater than that, to read one book together. We hope you have enjoyed reading Hudson Bay Bound, which tells the remarkable 85-day journey of the first women to canoe the 2,000-mile route from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. Following the route made famous by Eric Sevareid, who is the North Dakota native, in his 1935 classic, Canoeing with the Cree, Natalie and her friend Ann Raiho faced unexpected trials, some harrowing and some simply odd. Warren's account retraces the women's journey from inspiration to the Arctic waters, giving readers an insider view from the practicalities of planning a 3-month canoe trip to their successful completion and accomplishment of the adventure of a lifetime. Tonight it is my great privilege to introduce the author herself. Dr. Natalie Warren is a Minnesota author, scholar, and public speaker on environmental issues. She has canoed the length of the Mississippi River and won first place in the Yukon River Quest in the Women's Voyager Division, paddling 450 miles in 53 hours. I know. But I definitely admire that. She's a contributing writer to outdoor publications. She has worked with the Bancroft Arneson Explore, St. Croix River Association, and River Management Society, and started a nonprofit to present urban rivers as natural dynamic classrooms for youth. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Warren, and thank you for your vital support of libraries.
Hi, thank you so much, Lori, for that introduction. The math doesn't totally make sense when you do that Yukon River Quest trip, but it was an experience. So my name's Natalie Warren. In 2011, I was one of the first 2 women to paddle from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay, inspired by Eric Sevareid's route from the book Canoeing with the Cree. On that journey and on many other canoe expeditions that I've been on, music has always been a really big part of my canoe trips. We would just sing songs in the boat all day. So I'm going to start things off tonight by singing a song called Across the Great Divide. I actually drove from Minneapolis to here today, so I crossed the divide, the Mississippi watershed, Hudson Bay watershed. It's amazing that you can just drive that quickly, and it took us like a month to paddle here. And I'll premise this with that I'm a saxophone player.
Well, I've been walking in my sleep. I've been counting troubles instead of counting sheep. And where the years went, I just can't say. I just turn around and they've gone away. And I've been sifting through the layers of dusty books and faded papers. They tell a story that I used to know, one that happened so long ago, and it's gone away in yesterday. Now I find myself on the mountainside, where the rivers change direction across the great divide. Now I heard the owl calling so softly as the night was falling. She asked a question and I replied, but she's gone now across the borderline, and it's gone away in yesterday. Now I find myself on the mountainside, where the rivers change direction across the great divide. The finest hour that I have seen, it is the one that comes between the edge of night and the break of day. It's when that darkness, it rolls away, and it's gone away in yesterday. Now I find myself on the mountainside, where the rivers change direction across the great divide.
Thank you. I'm going to start things off by reading the prologue of my book, part of it. I was very lucky to be able to have this story published through the University of Minnesota Press in 2021. Sometimes a great adventure lands in your lap. That's exactly what happened on a chilly February day in my dorm room at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. Anne flung open the door of my room with fire in her eyes and a book in her hand. I had been cooped up all day writing a paper. The interruption, although abrupt, was a welcome break to a gloomy and uneventful day. She lingered in the doorway with a familiar smirk on her face. "Yes, Anne, how can I help you this fine evening?" I asked facetiously. We'd been scheming trips together for 4 years, and it seemed every adventure started with Anne standing in the doorway with that same expression. She threw the book at me from across the room. "Read this," she said. "We should do it." I looked down at the book, Canoeing with the Cree, now lying on the bed in front of me. There was a silhouette of 2 people paddling a canoe on the cover. I looked back up to respond, but Anne was gone. The monotony of the day was getting to me. I needed a break. Reading a chapter or 2 would provide a welcome respite from schoolwork. But after the first few chapters, I just kept going, flying through the story of 2 men, Eric Sevareid and Walter C. Port, who in 1930 paddled from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. They were fresh out of high school and didn't have sleeping bags or maps for the long journey. Their story was documented by the Minneapolis Star, and their adventurous spirit brought them to the shores of Hudson Bay, inspiring supporters and skeptics across the country. Sevareid and Port traveled through agricultural rivers and wild waters of the North. I began wondering what those rivers looked like today. If we decided to make the trip, would we too get lost on Mud Lake near the headwaters of the Minnesota River and be hopelessly windbound on Lake Winnipeg? Hours passed as I continued reading, furiously flipping pages about the Native community at Norway House and how Eric and Walter went to church at York Factory on the shores of Hudson Bay. Meanwhile, the gray sky outside my window had turned to black. The cafeteria was long closed by now, so I shoved a granola bar into my mouth and finished the last few pages of the book by headlamp. I closed the book and shut my eyes. Yes, I want to do this trip, I thought. Why not? Everyone around me was frantically applying for jobs, and very few people were hearing back from prospective employers. What else was I going to do after graduation? I wanted something more than the seemingly predictable life path in front of me. I felt an itch to do something crazy. An energy inside me was overflowing, yearning to get out and get going, and no internship or entry-level job could fulfill my desire to live and breathe and feel the earth around me. The next day, I threw the book back at Anne and said, "I'm in." This is the story of how Ann Raiho and I became the first 2 women to recreate Eric Sevareid and Walter Port's route to Hudson Bay. A route that has been attempted and sometimes completed many times since it was popularized in 1930. It is also an account of the present-day condition of the lakes and rivers between the Twin Cities and Hudson Bay, the people who live on these waters, and the communities that shape them. It explores the intrinsic connection that human beings have to moving water and reflects on raw challenges we faced as 2 women making history. So I want to back up here real quick. This is me in high school. I'm from Miami, Florida. I did not grow up canoeing or camping. I didn't know what flannel was, and I had never been on a farm by the time I was in high school. I went to an art school for saxophone performance in downtown Miami, and when I was about 15, I realized that I was not going to be the next Cannonball Adderley or John Coltrane, and I needed to figure out what other things I might be interested in doing. I had a friend who would come back from summer break looking really tan and happy every year, and when you're not tan and happy, you're looking at other people like, what are they doing? And he said, I go to a place called the Boundary Waters every summer. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this wilderness area in northern Minnesota. So I had never been canoeing before, but I'm the youngest of 3 children. I like to sort of stomp into my house and make big announcements to get attention. And I went home that day and I told my mother I was gonna go to Minnesota that summer. And growing up in Miami, the Midwest really was sort of a gray blob in the middle of the country to me, and my mom agreed to to let me sign up for a 2-week canoe trip through YMCA Camp Minojan in the Boundary Waters. So I went up to the North Woods for the very first time. I remember getting the packing list back at home and my family sitting around the dining room table trying to figure out what a fleece was. So we knew it was a fabric. I had a lot to learn, and I learned it quickly. I went on a 2-week trip with 6 other women, and there were a lot of cultural differences. We talked a lot about the difference between bagels and bagels and pop and soda on this trip. And I weaved my way crookedly at first, but finally found my stride in a canoe. I opened a letter from my mother that she had written for me, and it was tear-stained, beautiful, encouraging. We're so proud of you. And at the end it said, we hope you enjoy the beautiful mountains of Minnesota. No one really knew where I was or where I continued to go every summer after that. I remember, too, on this trip, waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of wolves howling, and I was legitimately concerned I was going to be eaten alive. And so I woke up my tent mates, and I told them the wolves are coming for us, and they paused, and they listened, and they started laughing, because it was not the howl of the wolf, but it was the call of the loon, and they told me I could go back to sleep. I came up to Minojan every summer. The summer after that, I did a 30-day canoe trip in Wabakimi Provincial Park. And then the summer before college, I went on a 50-day canoe trip in Nunavut, Canada, paddling the Inuit heritage rivers, the Kazan and Coonwalk, to Baker Lake. Now, this expedition was life-changing, but perhaps more mesmerizing than the thousands of migrating caribou or the musk oxen lazily grazing by the river was the woman who was assigned to be my paddling partner. This is Ann Raiho. So Ann Raiho, unlike me, grew up romping in the woods. She grew up canoeing in Minnesota. In many ways, she was the woman I was pretending to be. And I thought she was so cool, and I was really excited when we were assigned paddling partners. On our first day, we were making small talk, and I said, well, where are you going to college in the fall? And she said, St. Olaf College. And I said, no way, me too. And we ended up in the same freshman dorm, and that's where we schemed for 4 years, and the prologue takes off. We were often asked why it was important to be the first 2 women to recreate this historic route, and my first thought, and Ann's too, was that we were surprised no women had done it before. Our social circle is full of women who do stuff like this all the time, and we didn't possess superpowers beyond other paddlers. Anne had simply struck gold finding a beloved canoe route and story to recreate, and I was smart enough to say yes. But the more I've experienced what it means to be a woman as an adult, the more impressed I am with what we did. I didn't expect to encounter such direct sexism beyond the subtle interactions and barriers all women face when we try to do anything out of the ordinary. But naysayers fanned a fire in us to prove we could be the first 2 women to paddle this route. I talk about a guy in the book who laughed at us when we told him where we were going. He said we wouldn't make it to Hudson Bay until October if we made it at all. He even promised to send us a keg of beer if we actually finished. But when we got there in August, he was the first person we called, and he didn't even remember who we were. We also received responses from sponsorship requests saying, who cares that you were the first 2 women to do this? Women have had the right to vote for decades now, as if we lived in a post-sexist society. I was nervous to do this trip in the first place because of the looming story that if we make one wrong step in life, that we might mess up everything. Women especially are told to constantly orient themselves towards socially constructed, acceptable life milestones, college, jobs, marriage, house, kids, retirement, and so on. But many of us sit back and wonder, what if that is not what we want? Ann and I wanted to break out of that mold and to do something different. 2 women going canoeing for 3 months tells an alternate narrative to life, and one that is not heard enough, and one that I'm glad to be able to tell through my book. Whoop, I got disconnected here. And we'll start over. Just kidding. Thanks for your patience. Okay, here's our route. We started paddling upstream on the Minnesota River. This check mark here, you actually have to travel southwest before you can cut north at Mankato. And then you might be familiar with this stretch here. We took the Red River, bordering the Dakotas and Minnesota, across into Canada through the city of Winnipeg, up the east shore, 280 miles of Lake Winnipeg. And then we took a couple different rivers here. We took the Nelson River to the Etchemamish to the Hayes, all the way out to York Factory on Hudson Bay. So we diverge a little bit from the Canoeing with the Cree route as they took the God's Loop there. We launched June 2nd, 2011, during the 2011 flood, which I imagine you also experienced here. So the river was crested 20 feet above its normal level, and Pike Island, where we were supposed to depart from, was underwater. And so we found a random inlet at Fort Snelling State Park to push off. People told us we would not be able to paddle upstream in flood conditions, but we thought we'd give it a go. And here we are, launching. I remember thinking, if we get sideswept, we'll just do the Mississippi River instead. But we're inching along, appreciating every leaf on every tree. Can anyone guess how many miles per hour we could paddle upstream during a flood? I'm hearing 1 and 2. It's about 1.5 miles an hour. To put that into perspective, you can walk the Minnesota River faster than we canoed it. But the hardest part of any expedition for me is the planning phase, where you're getting maps together and packing out food and logistics. And finally, we had everything we needed in our canoes, and our only job was to paddle, eat, and sleep, and do that again and again for 3 months. Before we left on our journey, people told us that the Minnesota River is the river of chocolate milk. It's a dirty, polluted agricultural river, and it's too bad you have to paddle it as a part of this route. We had very low expectations for this part of our journey. But on our first day, we were paddling through a national wildlife refuge. Otters came to swim by our boat, wishing us good luck on our journey and a sign of fairly good ecosystem health. We found the Minnesota River to be this beautiful gem for recreation, and it felt like we had it all to ourselves. That being said, the Minnesota River is also a dirty, polluted agricultural river. I studied environmental studies and policy in college, and so I was fresh out of thinking, writing, and talking and reading about a lot of these agricultural issues and environmental issues in the Midwest. So I thought I knew what I was talking about, but we were launched into this landscape, and I found it to be very different than what I was expecting. On our first couple days, I noticed that there was a severe lack of buffer zones, an area of vegetation in between where the corn and soybeans stop and the river begins that helps filter out a lot of the chemicals that we're using on conventional farm fields. And I started to feel kind of upset about this because I knew that the nitrogen and the phosphorus from these fields were going into the Minnesota River. They were flowing into the Mississippi River. They were creating the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where that excess nitrogen causes algal blooms and depletes the oxygen and doesn't allow for aquatic life to thrive. So we were paddling through the beginning of a global food and water crisis. In the way that we grow our food directly pollutes our water resources. But because it was flooded, we couldn't find anywhere to camp, and so we find ourselves knocking on farmers' doors, and they would have us over for dinner, they would let us camp on their fields, and at a very young age, we were able to sit across the table with people with very different lived experiences than our own and ask them, why do you grow all the way to the river? And to hear them say, because we get paid based on yield, because we're in debt, because we're trying to send our kids to school, and they're not coming back to take over the farm, we started to understand the complexities behind a lot of these issues as we paddled north. Ann and I would encounter a lot of these drainage pipes. So it's common practice on agricultural fields to drain the water to protect your crop from floods. But this area used to be 18 million acres of prairie and wetland. So when the water used to fall, the rain would fall, it would seep into the ground. It would recharge the groundwater system. It would maybe trickle to a nearby stream. But now, because we've plowed all of this land, less than 1% of that 18 million acres remains. When the water falls to the ground, it gets pushed out to the river like a high-speed train. And as a result, the Minnesota River holds more water in it than it has in recent history. And as it rushes downstream, it erodes the banks of the river, carrying that sediment with the flow all the way until Lake Pepin, where it gets a chance to settle, which is slowly filling in with this sediment. Ann and I had been on a lot of Arctic adventures and wilderness trips where you sing a song, you write a poem, you canoe, it's beautiful. Maybe you have a storm that challenges you. But this trip was very different. As we were paddling directly past human impact on the land, we would go past things like this energy plant and feel the difference in water temperature upstream and downstream of the plant and try to understand how that impacts the ecosystem that we now called home. This is a picture of us paddling up to the Granite Falls Dam. So you can see the current's pretty strong. We're paddling as hard as we can, and I remember looking over at a tree, and the tree wasn't moving. So we're just on this treadmill. And in between big breaths, I say, Ann, let's just pull over and carry or portage all of our gear to the other side of the dam and put back in where the current isn't as strong. We agreed to do this, but as we were getting closer to shore, 2 photographers jumped out of the bushes and started taking our picture and saying, you can do it, you can paddle all the way to the dam. And so, of course, we have a sense of pride, and we continue paddling, inching along. It took us about 45 minutes to go less than half a mile. But meanwhile, the community of Granite Falls trickled to the riverbank to cheer us on. When we got to the takeout spot, the mayor came to greet us. And he shook our hand enthusiastically and said, wow, I've never even seen 2 guys do that before. And I remember thinking, why would anyone do that? So here we are getting closer to where many of you call home. This picture is at the headwaters of the Red River of the North, where the Otter Tail meets the Bois de Sioux at Wahpeton. We were finally paddling downstream. So if we were going 10, maybe 15 miles a day, paddling all day on the Minnesota River, how many miles a day do you think we could paddle downstream during a flood on the Red River? Really great mumbling all around. So we were going about 50 to 60 miles a day, partly just because we could, and we were just thrilled to be going downstream. The Red River is a very windy, twisty river, as you are probably familiar, but during flood stage, we could paddle straight across those bends, straight across cornfields as the corn bent with the current beneath our canoes. On our journey, we came across a lot of small towns, and people would show us around, and the story kept repeating. This place used to be really cool, but insert Walmart 10 miles away. We came across this monument representing the disappearance of the family farm. It's 5 empty tractor seats. And we kept hearing this story over and over again of how it used to take an entire community to farm, or at least an entire family to farm. But with the advancements in agricultural technology, you now can feasibly have a few people farming thousands of acres of land. And while that is great for the industry, it has an impact on the communities that have been built up around the river here. But far beyond just this desolate place that used to have people, we got to know the people in these communities. They would take us in, and they had a sense of place that completely brought me to my knees. They loved where they lived. They knew the river better than anyone else. This is a picture of us with the International Water Institute in Climax, Minnesota. They threw a barbecue for us when we came through. And everyone at this barbecue kept coming up to us, telling us the same story about a woman in their neighboring town of Fertile who was murdered in their community. And the next morning, the newspaper title read, "Fertile Woman Dies in Climax." And that is their favorite joke, or maybe their least favorite joke, in Climax, Minnesota. But we got to hear from these people on how they're reconnecting with the Red River. It is something that communities are turning back towards. They're getting involved with citizen science, doing water quality monitoring, actually getting out and kayaking and canoeing on this important waterway. So we had to cross the border into Canada on the Red River, and Ann is much better at small details and logistics than I am, and so she had contacted the border station. She told them what we were doing. She sent over pictures of our passports, and they agreed to meet us on the river so that we wouldn't have to portage all of our gear to the border station and then back, which would have taken the whole day for us. But that being said, we still had no idea what to expect. So we push off from Pembina in the morning like any other day, and we turn a bend, and there's a bridge with 2 huge black SUVs on top. And when they see us, they turn their sirens on, and they drive down to the riverbank. Now, the Red River, as you probably know, is a muddy, mucky river, especially during high water. We were caked in mud for weeks. And so 6 border agents come out of their vehicles, and they all stand in a row, beckoning us to come, and watching this performance unfold before them, in which we can't just hop out on solid ground. We paddle as far as we can until we get stuck in mud, and then we hop out and we do our quick feet so we don't sink in the mud. And finally, we pull our canoe up, we slop over to them, and they look at us, and they look at the mud, and they look at our canoe, and they're like, "We're not gonna go over there." So why don't you just bring your gun? We brought a shotgun with us for extra protection in polar bear country, and we'll take one of you over to the station to sign a waiver. So Ann went with 3 of them, and I hung out with these 3 border agents on the river for about 45 minutes. It felt like several hours, though. I pride myself in having fairly good social skills, and I remember it was dead-end conversation after dead-end conversation, and I thought, where the heck is Ann? Well, Ann, when she's nervous, she turns bright red, and it's a hot July day. You know, she's still wearing her life jacket, and so she was accused of acting suspiciously because she was red and sweating. And finally, she returns, and we push off. We got these guys to smile for the first time, and then we rounded the bend. We were so excited to get to Canada this whole time because we're burning thousands of calories a day. We were always hungry, and we were excited to eat the Canadian delicacy poutine. French fries covered in gravy and cheese curds, and so we stopped into the first small town we found, and we walked to a small bar, and we pushed the door open, and we said, "Do y'all have poutine?" And the bartender said, "We have the best poutine in Manitoba." I said, "Great." So we carbo loaded, and the beauty of paddling with just one other person who you trust so much is that you can make really impulsive decisions together. We decided, hey, we have 100 miles to go on the Red River until we get to Winnipeg. There are no more obstructions in the way before we get to the city. Let's paddle that 100 miles straight overnight. So we drank some coffee, carbo loaded on poutine, and we pushed off. This is the sun beginning to set around 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. We knew there would be a full moon that night to guide our way. It started to get a little bit chilly, and we started to get tired, and so we had about a 2-hour repertoire of music that we would sing every day, and we started singing it at the top of our lungs to stay awake. I remember we're singing Cat Stevens' Moon Shadow, but we only knew one verse, so we would just repeat that over and over and over and over again. But we really liked the idea that as we paddled through this suburban area south of Winnipeg, that people had their windows open in the summer and could hear river sirens going through the night. At this point in our journey, it's 5 a.m., and we can feasibly calculate we're paddling 5 miles an hour. We'll be in Winnipeg at 7 a.m. Ann's parents were meeting us there. We were going to stay in a hotel. We were going to sleep. We were going to go out to eat. We were really looking forward to these modern comforts. So in our last push, we finally get to the outskirts of Winnipeg, and there's just this huge sign pointing at the river that says danger. And our difference in personalities shines again, where I'm like, funny sign, and I keep paddling, and Ann's like, this is pointed towards the river. This is for us. And so we pulled over, and Ann walked over to the sign looking for a number to call, and I overhear her calling random authority figures in Winnipeg, and nobody knew what she was talking about, this danger sign on the river. So she comes back defeated, and we push off around the corner and found the danger, a huge dam with rushing white water and a control tower at top, and they had opened the floodgates around the city of Winnipeg. which seemed ridiculous to us that instead of restoring the floodplains and prairies that we had been paddling through, we had seen the erosion in a lot of these agricultural fields that used to be natural systems with the ability to alleviate the negative impacts of flooding. It was decided first to put billions of dollars towards forcefully rerouting the river around the city. Ann and I portaged 3 times over a bunch of boulders across the street and down the other side, and we were not in a good mood at this point. People always expect 2 young women to be in good moods, and someone came out of the control tower with their cup of coffee and said, "Hey, ladies, where are you going?" And we were just like, "We're going to Hudson Bay," and we kept walking. And then Ann stops in her tracks and she turns around and she just starts yelling at this guy to put a phone number on the danger sign while I'm dragging her down the other side saying, "Thanks for letting us portage your dam." We finally made it to Winnipeg. As you can see here, this is near where the Assiniboine River flows into the Red River. It was extremely flooded still, but we got to stay in a hotel. We got to go out to eat. We saw Ann's parents. We got to see the premiere of Harry Potter, smelliest people in the theater. And Ann's mom gave us this little bear kit, just in case we had a bear encounter. It was with foghorn and flares. It kind of looked a little extra, like something from Pinterest. And we're like, "Thanks, Pam. Hope we don't have to use this." And then we launched back off on the next big part of our journey, Lake Winnipeg. So Lake Winnipeg is the 11th largest lake in the world in terms of surface area, but it is a very shallow lake, which means when the wind blows, it picks up the waves quickly. And if you've read Canoeing with the Cree or Hudson Bay Bound, you can actually get picked up on the waves and crashed to the bottom of the lake where the rocks are protruding. It is a very dangerous lake to paddle, and people told us not to paddle it. Eric Sevareid and Walter Port got towed for the second half of Lake Winnipeg. Ann and I were nervous, but we decided that we'd give it a try. When we got there, the lake was completely flat. It was glass. You couldn't tell where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky. And we thought, what's everyone talking about? This will be a breeze. Well, slowly but surely, the wind did begin to blow. We started paddling at night and sleeping during the day, and paddling whenever the wind was not strong. We were doing a night paddle, and this big, thick wave of hot air came over us and raised the hair on our arms, telling us maybe we should pull over. And so we did, and just then, as we were setting up camp, a huge lightning storm came through. The sky was orange, and the lightning strikes illuminated the vast lake in front of us that now had big waves crashing towards shore. So we were thankful something had told us to pull over. That night, as I was about to fall asleep, I look up one last time at the blue nylon of our tent, and I see 2 huge black bear claws pushing back down. And I jumped to the other side of the tent, and I said something I never thought I would say, which is, "Ann, get the foghorn." And so here we are rummaging in a storm through all of our gear. Ann grabs this foghorn triumphantly and goes to push it, and it just goes, which is fine. It's a black bear. We counted to 3. We ran out of our tent. We looked big, and we scared it into the dark woods. But not an hour later, the wind picked up and lifted the sides of our tent, and we disassembled our gear and followed that bear into the dark woods to sit in lightning position. The next morning, the waves and wind were still too strong for us to leave, and so we were making a leisurely breakfast. And I remember grabbing the foghorn and thinking, I can't believe this thing didn't work last night. And we pushed it, and it goes, bah! It's a little bit too late. We would see storm systems coming toward us all day, and we would paddle as long as we could until we would pull over and wait them out. It took us 18 days to paddle Lake Winnipeg. 7 of those days, we were windbound, unable to paddle. We were setting up camp one day, making a leisurely meal, which we didn't always have the opportunity to do, and a snake came by. And then another snake came by, and then another snake came by. I maybe overreacted, but we look into the driftwood that's in the berm, and there are a bunch of snakes twisted in. Fun fact, Manitoba has the highest population of snakes in the world because they overwinter in huge limestone cracks at the Narcissa snake dens, which were not 100 miles away from where we were camping, which is something I did not know before I agreed to do this trip. But we non-verbally packed all of our gear, went to launch, and realized the waves were too strong. We eventually made it around the corner, reset up camp a little further away from the snakes, but it's very demoralizing to be able to see your previous campsite from your current campsite on an expedition like this. And there we stayed for 3 days. Ann and I were doing a night paddle. The lake was completely flat, the stars were out, the Milky Way was out, and it was reflecting on the water, so it looked like we were paddling through space. Ann and I were together, just the two of us, for 100 days straight. And we got along really well for the most part, but we were starting to build tension at this point in our expedition. I was in the stern directing where the canoe went, and I thought, flat lake, let's make some ground tonight. And so I pointed toward the middle of the lake, and Ann asked me to point closer to shore so that we can get out if we needed to, if the winds picked up. And I thought I had, but it was the simple sway of the bow back to the middle of the lake that made us crack. We just started yelling at each other about all this stuff that had happened back in college, up through our trip, just pulling the weeds of our relationship until we reached a point where we were not talking to each other. Still just fuming. But unbeknownst to us, while we were fighting, the northern lights had started to glow in the sky, started as a small orb and then expanded into strings of green and pink. And as we paddled alone in this massive still lake with the northern lights all around us, I thought, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I want so badly to tell Ann that I'm so glad she's here with me, but I wasn't talking to her. And the only thing we said to each other that night, I said, well, I think I'm overcompensating now. Can you shine your headlamp towards shore and see how far away we are? And she does, and there were these 2 huge green eyes of a bull moose staring back at us, not 100 yards away. And she says, yep, we're too close to shore. The next morning, we camped, and the wind had picked up, and so we were taking a leisurely morning. I'll read you a little excerpt here from the book. Ann looked mad at me even in her sleep. I rummaged through our bag of trail notes and opened one from my older brother. Natalie and Ann, you two are doing the coolest thing imaginable after graduation. All I did was cook fish and smoke pot for a year. This blows that out of the water. Good luck and safe travels. Natalie, I am so unbelievably proud of you. You have more guts than anyone I know, and you are using them to the fullest. Don't listen to anyone who does not recognize your form of ambition. I love you very much and can't wait to see what you will do next. Love, your brother, Tim. His words reminded me of the real reason we were doing this expedition. Tears flowed down my cheeks as I flipped to an empty page in my journal. For me, writing has always been easier than talking. So I grabbed my pen in hopes that it would help me articulate my heart and mind. Ann, we knew that doing this trip would take lots of planning and time spent with each other. I think the fact we wanted to do the trip together is a testament to how much we value our relationship. Even though this trip may be difficult, we will come out strong. I'm sorry if I've seemed careless. In a way, I thought if I kept my cool, maybe we could counterbalance each other. I know you think I view you as an anxious person, and I think you view me as a careless person, but we should work to change that before any more resentment builds. Last night was a spectacular paddle, and I was happy you were there to share the night sky with me. I have really enjoyed our trip so far, every windbound day and every rainstorm. In fact, I just felt a raindrop. We should play cribbage. I think the main thing I wanted to say was that we are sisters. Like sisters, we accept the other for their differences, fight occasionally, and recognize that our friendship is forever. P.S. This lake is huge. I handed Ann the letter when she woke up. The wind was too strong and the waves were too large to paddle. I lay on my back, watching the side of the tent cave in and push out, swaying back and forth in the wind. Ann looked up from the note. Want to play cribbage? Our relationship only improved from then on, as is often the case when you confront conflict. We continued in the North Basin of Lake Winnipeg, and we encountered this huge green, slimy carpet, algal blooms that were floating around with the wind caused directly from the agricultural runoff coming from the Red River. It has had a huge impact on the fishing industry and tourism industry in this part of the lake. We finally got to the Nelson River. When we got to Hudson Bay, we didn't cry. But when we knew we had finished paddling Lake Winnipeg, we just bawled. We had this perfect tailwind pushing us to the next leg of our journey. We arrived at Norway House, a Cree First Nation community, just in time for York Boat Days festival. The whole community was out singing songs, making food, welcoming us to their town. They raced these huge York boats that the Hudson Bay Company used to use for trading in this area. So you get about 10 people paddling, and they have a big race, and the winner of the race gets $10,000. And for a community in which 85% of its population is on welfare, this was a big, big deal. So we watched the races, and I noticed everyone started to line up in the middle of town. And I asked Mike Mushwagen, who we were staying with, what's going on? And he said, oh, actually, this event was created by the Canadian government to celebrate the day that our lands were stolen. And every year, we line up to receive an annual payment of $5 for reparations of generations of injustice and stolen lands. Ann and I stayed up late that night with the Mushwagen family, hearing more about both the successes of the young people coming back to their community and making a difference, and also the challenges where they live. Access to good food and cheap food is a huge deal up here, as their one grocery store is outposted from Winnipeg, and things like milk and cheese and vegetables are extremely expensive. And so people are eating more processed foods than they have historically and experiencing different diseases like diabetes now entering their community. They also told us that they have a stray dog problem, which we had seen dogs running around all day, and that in the winter the dogs pack up and attack people. And so Mike, we're all just hanging out on the couches, and he's like, you know, you ladies are going into polar bear country. You should take a dog, and if a polar bear comes, it'll eat your dog, and you'll have time to load your gun. And we sort of laughed this off, and I remember going to sleep that night in the same room as Ann, and we're like, should we? No, we shouldn't. But the next day, we were walking around as if we were window shopping for the perfect canoe dog. And that night we drove around with Mike's daughter, Crystal, and we saw the silhouette of a dog licking ketchup packets off the ground outside of their movie theater, and I just ran out and grabbed her and put her in the car. This is Maihan. Mahihan in Cree means wolf, and we liked to think that she was part wolf. We put her in our canoe the next day, and it turns out she's afraid of water. This actually works out really well. If you've ever tried to canoe with a dog who loves water, it's very challenging. And so Maihan would just sleep in the canoe throughout the day and then run around and hunt at night. We finally had someone to blame those nighttime sounds on, right when you're about to fall asleep when you're camping and you hear a stick crack and it sounds like a bear, but it's probably a mouse. We're like, oh, it's just Maihan. One morning, we woke up, got out of our tent, and saw a severed beaver hand outside, and not sure the story there, but we like to think that that was a peace offering and Maihan welcoming us into her family. She was by no means live bait to us. She was a third member of our expedition, and Ann's mom likes to joke that we then knew what it was like to be married with a kid, because now everything was, oh, Maihan's doing this. Oh, look how cute Maihan is today. We finally reached the Hayes River. We were paddling whitewater sets as fun and joy came back to our relationship again. Paddling to Hudson Bay showed me that what we do on land greatly impacts the water. Water quality usually does not collapse overnight. It degrades slowly as a result of small compromises and seemingly harmless encroachments of industry and development sprinkled across a watershed. On this expedition, we witnessed the water change from polluted agricultural rivers where we had to fill large water jugs until the next resupply, usually at a gas station, to the beautiful, clean Arctic waters of the Hayes River, where we had the rare privilege of drinking water directly from the river without filtering. We just had our cups clipped to our life jackets. This is an experience many of you have probably not have, and many people will never have. The Hayes River, unlike other sections of our expedition, is relatively untouched by humans. It has room to breathe, to sink into the landscape, and expand into the woods. It effortlessly provided us with fresh water and abundant fish to eat. This pristine waterway reminded us of what rivers once were, in a sense, of what we have already lost, and of what could come back with new ways of living in and with the world. Now, there are a couple points of reference that I want to show you before I read a journal entry and show you some video clips from the last section of our trip. So this is White Mud Falls. It's the last whitewater set before 200 kilometers of free-flowing river that pushes you out to Hudson Bay. We were moving from the forest to the taiga to the tundra, so the trees started to get shorter and shorter and shorter as we got closer to the bay. This is us back on the Echemamish. Echemamish in Cree means river that flows both ways, and in many places the current was just that, very confusing. There was a lot of beaver activity on this section of our trip and swampy lands, and so we would often come across these obstructions from beavers and sticks in our way that we'd have to lift our canoe over. This is Maihan trying to figure out her new life in a canoe. We were pulling over a smaller one of these later on in the day, and I didn't put my boots on. I just stepped out, pulled the canoe up, and when I brought my feet back in, I had 55 leeches sucking at the end of my toes. But now I'm not afraid of leeches, so it's good. This part of our trip is where the bugs were the worst. As you can sort of see, it's a marshy landscape. And Ann and I are very, very competitive, and so we didn't complain at all until one night when they all came, and we just looked at each other and ran into our tent. You can camp anywhere. We had to move a fallen tree to set up our tent this night before a Class 3 set the next day. We started to get a little bit loopy.
Cooking away.
Our nonstick pan was sticky.
What did the dog think of that? Hi, hon. Say hello to the GoPro. Yay! Let's see. 84? I don't know.
It was great having Maihan along for our few portages. Across 2,000 miles, our longest portage was 1 mile. It's amazing how these waters are intricately connected. But Maihan would run the rough path in front of us, and we would encounter fresh bear scat, but we knew that the wildlife had already been aware of our presence. I'm going to read the journal entry that I wrote when we got to Hudson Bay. We ran several rapids until we reached White Mud Falls, our last set, portage, anything. I felt very emotional because I knew that after this portage, there was nothing that could stop us from making it to York Factory. The last few days brought emotional and physical challenges that left us exhausted and sore. After almost 3 months on trail, we were finally ready to end our trip. I felt a lack of nutrition had worn on my health, and I couldn't wait until I could eat fruits and vegetables again. While the hope of York Factory and relaxation was at our fingertips, we still had 200 kilometers to go on the river, and the rumors of polar bear country echoing in our minds. We paddled hard. Endurance and longevity are our strengths, and we planned to make the 4-day trip from White Mud to York Factory in a mere 2 days. Our day lasted 15 hours before the sun made us retire to the shore. The moon did not show as we built our first fire to fight the cold. We planned to stay up all night, but after an hour, we felt the weight of our exhaustion and gave in to the comfort of our tent and sleeping bags. Ironically, for Ann, it was one of her best nights of sleep, despite our anxiety in polar bear country. I slept, but I dreamt of creatures surrounding the tent and felt a deep sorrow that we would never actually make it to the end. We left camp that morning without breakfast and continued on the flowing haze. We heard stories of a thick fog and dark clouds typical to this section of the river, but we had a clear morning. We approached the turn where the God's River joins the haze and saw our first woodland caribou swimming across the water. The current quickened at the conjunction, and we had a floating breakfast of cold quinoa and chili powder from the night before. We continued on our way. With 10 more hours of paddling ahead, we felt as far away from York Factory as we ever had. Our wrists ached, hands clenched, and minds more than anything were on the verge of insanity. The river was beautiful, though. There were high white mud cliffs on the right and low-lying spruces on the left, decorating the shoreline, always reminding us of our desolation. Our strokes slowed and stomachs turned, and we became desperate for the hours to pass. All of a sudden, from behind us, we heard a huge clap of thunder that spooked us both. Just then, a pack of wolves, 5 total, 1 black, came out to the riverbank from behind the spruce. The air was still. There was a suspicious calm. The wolves stopped in their tracks when they felt our presence. We stared. They stared. My hand barked. A bird broke the silence with a loud cry, and the sound brought goosebumps to our skin. We glanced at the dark cloud floating behind us, and we were off with the motivation reminiscent of our efforts on the Red River. We reached the rock, a big rock on the riverbank that signified our remaining distance of 50 kilometers, 40 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 2 more hours. We sang every song we knew, including some Christmas medleys. We saw seals, caribou, black bear. Every white rock looked as if it were swimming our way, and I joked that someone should spray paint them all black to soothe the nerves of canoeists on the haze. We were 10 kilometers away. We were hungry, tired, and desperate. It felt as though something could still go wrong. A storm, a bear. Could we really just arrive unscathed at York Factory? We passed the point where the tide effect would slow us down, but we were still moving steadily toward the bay. We turned left, and there it was, Hudson Bay. Overwhelmed with hunger, we did not joyously celebrate the sight of the bay, but solemnly paddled toward it. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't quite know how to feel. These last few days have been some of the most trying days of my life, and I knew I could relax now, but I felt an emptiness as well. This has been my lifestyle for 85 days, and there was no party or trophy at the end, just a set of stairs leading up to a building that once manufactured York boats. How was this a major destination for canoeists? The history is interesting, and we were in awe at the expanse of water. But what made our voyage so significant and important to others? I do not yet understand the magnitude of our adventure and the importance of being the first 2 women to complete it. I'm sure I will reflect on these questions for years to come. So we got to York Factory, which, when Eric Sevareid and Walter Port got there, they went to church. There was still a community there. And when we got there, right now, it's a historic site that you can only get to by boat or by plane, so they don't get a lot of visitors. And we go up these old stairs, and we take the caretakers by surprise, and they said, "It's a good thing you're here, because the season is ending early, and we're all leaving tomorrow." We had just paddled 200 kilometers in 2 days. And, if no one was there, we had our satellite phone to call our float plane. But because they were there, we got to stay indoors in an area with high polar bear activity. So I mentioned in my journal that we were really hungry. We didn't want to waste time eating because that's time we needed to spend paddling because we wanted to get there so badly. And so we plop all of our stuff down and we just start cooking the best meal of our lives, dehydrated hash browns and beans and everything we had left, and shoving our faces. And the caretaker's like, "We should probably go inside." And we're like, "We're hungry." But then a polar bear comes around the bend. It's a young polar bear. It's just meandering along the shore. And this is what we've been avoiding seeing for quite some time. And so Ann and I, in a panic, look at each other, and we look up at the caretaker, who seems relaxed, and we're like, we're ready to go inside. And so we were able to have the rare privilege of seeing a polar bear in the wild from the safety of the caretaker's house. We got a tour of York Factory, and you can see here the eroded bank of the river, they were telling us that the bank erodes an average of 8 meters a year as the permafrost is melting up in that area. And that white historic building where they have all of the old artifacts from the Hudson Bay Company that used to manufacture York boats there, strewn about on cross tables, has had to be moved 3 times in its original location. It would be where you see the river now. Ann and I got to sleep in this little tiny cabin you can see in the corner there. And she woke me up really early in the morning, and I remember thinking, we made it to Hudson Bay. Can I sleep in? And she's like, no, you got to see this. And so we push open this heavy metal door, and as the sun is rising, we see the polar bear running on the boardwalk, the caretaker's German shepherd chasing the polar bear, and the caretaker on an ATV with a gun chasing that, and they're all moving about the same speed across the horizon. And I look over at Ann, and I say, I think it's time to go home. So we hopped on a float plane, we hopped on a 35-hour train back to the city of Winnipeg. We were very nervous to cross the border back into the States. Our friends picked us up at the train station. They handed over our passports to the woman at the border station, and she said, well, where have y'all been? And she said, well, these ladies just paddled the Hudson Bay. And I was like, we have a gun and a dog and all these things. And she's like, no shit, go on ahead. I was like, okay. She also did her job really well, but it was less challenging than we imagined. And then we also branded our paddles there. We went to the end of the Gunflint Trail in the Boundary Waters where Ann's parents have a cabin, and we just sat there for 2 weeks decompressing, looking out at a lake that once seemed so large to us that now seemed very, very small. This expedition was a coming-of-age journey that became so much more than just 2 strong women exploring the wilderness. The scars on the landscape unfolded before our eyes as we paddled north. The harm done by industry and agriculture and the injustices done to First Nation communities were impossible to ignore as we moved with the land and water. We mourned what we have done to the earth and to each other as we paddled. Yet Robin Wall Kimmerer reminds us of the importance of grief in mourning, saying, if grief can be a doorway to love, then let us all weep for the world we are breaking apart so we can love it back to wholeness again. Methodically moving with a landscape teaches us to slow down, to look again, to observe, digest, and rethink our relationships with the world. Time, memory, history, evolving ideologies, and glimpses of a more resilient path live together in the water. As we are urgently called to action to build a resilient future in an era marked by human-caused climate change, moving with a landscape, deeply listening to and loving our surroundings teaches us the importance of thoughtful action so that we might pause and prioritize what the world needs from us instead of just what we need from the world. Good science and policy are vital to this cause, but so is our own relationship to the places that we are trying to protect. But sometimes we need reminding that it is not only okay but necessary to slow down and experience the world in and around us, to break our routines and have the courage to be shaped and reshaped by our encounters with the landscape. Yet, as you probably have felt before, it is almost always easier to stay home. This poem by Robert Bly helps me get out the door. What? You want to live your life over again? Well, I suppose, yes, that time in Grand Rapids, my life as I lived it was a series of shynesses. Being bolder, what good would that do? I'd open my door again. I felt abashed, you see. Now I'd go out and say, all right, I'll go with you to Alaska. Just opening the door from inside would have altered me a little. I'm too shy. And so a bolder life is what you want? We could begin now. Just walk with me down to the river. I'll pretend this boat is my life. I'll climb in. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take some questions. I know there's someone with a microphone. There we go. In the back, walking around if you have any. I'll also be in the back after this. If you need to leave, please leave. I respect that. And I'll be signing books as well. All right, we have a hand over here.
How many times did you capsize?
0. We almost submarined once. It was we were going through a rapid set. We didn't think we needed our spray skirt. Hubris. And the waves just were slowly crashing into our boat. And I was in the stern, so I could see all of this happening, but Ann was in the bow, and she had no idea. And we got through the rough part, and I just said, Ann, don't move and bail as fast as you can. You know, Maihan's just in this pool of water, like a little wet deer or something. And when the boat's filled with water, if you tip it all, it'll just roll. So we were able to bail and not capsize from that, but that was our closest call.
Before Winnipeg, you described that danger sign and having to pass a big dam. I assume that was where the floodway started.
Yeah.
And the question I have is, did you paddle the floodway or the river?
No, we paddled the river, and we just had to do that big portage to get to the other side.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. It was very motivating. And we read this book a long time back, but me and my wife were trying to do canoeing in Red River. And after reading this book, and our scaredness has gone down, definitely. When we always think that, okay, when Natalie and Ann can do, you can do. So little bit, from 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, thank you so much. But only one point is, so many problems came during this journey, like scratching of the beer, snakes, and big waves, night canoeing. Have you ever thought, both of you, let's stop now, let's in between?
No, I don't know why and there's a part of my prologue that I didn't read that touches on this a little bit, but we were just determined, and there was really no talking us out of it. And we would constantly go through worst case scenarios, like, okay, what if we get bit by a bear? Well, go to the hospital and then we'll come back. Or if our boat sinks, like, for sure someone will help us and we'll swim to shore. And so we talked through a lot of the scenarios, but it was never a conversation that we would stop. And I don't know quite how to describe that feeling. Yeah.
Will you share something about what your life is like now?
Yeah, I have 2 small children. I have a 5-month-old and a 3-year-old, and I get to sleep alone in a hotel room tonight. So I'm thrilled. I finished my PhD at the University of Minnesota in Communication Studies and Environmental Communication in April, and I've since been doing research with an EPA-funded team on the value of the Mississippi River, trying to pull human narratives and try to understand better the spiritual and cultural values that people have with water that are very, very hard to capture. And then actually in 2 weeks, I will be starting up as the Director of Stewardship and Education for Friends of the Mississippi River. So I'll be able to engage the public in the river where I live. Yeah, I'm excited. I can hear you, I think. I can repeat the question, too.
Quick questions. How many days did you have open to you? Did you make it to the Arctic Circle like the book says? And have you ever heard of the Nunsuch in the museum in Winnipeg?
Oh, no.
Did they ever get that thing down there?
I have no idea. So I have not heard of the Nunsuch. We did not go to the Arctic Circle. We just went out to the bay, so just south of Churchill is where the haze pops out there on Hudson Bay. And the first question was, how many days did we have the opportunity? So we paddled in 85 days. We gave ourselves 90 days and had to start grad school that fall. So we had a pretty short window for her to kind of...
I was thinking of the weather.
Yeah, near the end, it was in the 30s at night, and it started getting really cold, and it was late August.
What about frost, though?
Yep.
Freeze.
I don't think we got out just in time. So if you've read Canoeing with the Cree, it's a different story because they were up there until, October. So we were able to get a good window of, we didn't see snow or sleet or anything like that. Yeah. Yeah, we brought a travel guitar and a ukulele. There's some embarrassing YouTube videos of us actually singing a lot of songs. So yeah, that's what we would do at night. Yep.
So when you reported, how much, like, weight-wise?
Yeah, we had a lot of gear, which you probably noticed in the pictures or videos with us. And that's the beautiful thing about canoeing is you can bring a lot of stuff. Someone who we ran into on Lake Winnipeg who was kayaking and had everything very neat and tiny blogged about how much crap we had in our canoe. So again, there were a few portages, and we had to usually double back or triple back to get all of our stuff from one side to the next side. And our bags, our boat was only 45 pounds. Our packs were more like 50, 60 pounds at that point.
Back here.
Yep. Sorry. Oh, yes, and the microphone has been moving. I apologize.
I'm wondering, after the expedition, who got to keep the dog?
Yeah, great question. So Ann got to keep the dog. We had this plan where we would switch off every year, and that is a terrible idea. So that didn't happen, which is fine because Ann and Maihan were best friends for a decade, going on all sorts of adventures, and Maihan actually passed away last year. Yeah. There's one up here.
When last we left you, you had just graduated from St. Olaf. We know you have a doctorate. What has been your experience from St. Olaf to your doctorate?
Great interview question. So after this journey, I trickled my way back home to Miami, Florida, and I worked at Starbucks for 6 months, and it was weird because I'd just done this crazy thing, and I totally respect lifelong baristas, but it just wasn't quite how I imagined my life playing out. And then I went and I worked on farms in Washington, D.C. for a while, and then I decided, I've learned so much from this expedition, I want to be able to share that with people. And so I came back to Minnesota, and I started a nonprofit to do watershed education, and we would take kids out on the Minnesota River, and we'd stay with farmers, and we'd tour wastewater treatment plants, and, I just sort of scrapped together programming, and it was really fun. Through that, we paddled the length of the Mississippi River, the Illinois River, the Minnesota River again, and then I really needed to make money. And so I got an environmental policy job on the St. Croix River, and I did that for a while. I worked there for 3 years. I worked with Anne Bancroft with her Access Water team, women from all over the world doing expeditions and helping them out. And then my PhD program was a 5-year program. So all throughout this, I've always been doing, I never know what to put on a business card because I'm always doing 100 things at one time. But that's the trajectory, I suppose, of all of that. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about paddling the river when it was flooded. Is that legal?
I've done some illegal paddling, and this is legal. Yeah. Yes, it's not recommended. I'll leave it with that. We paddled the Chicago Sanitary Canal once and got kicked off by the Coast Guard. But paddling during a flood is legal. It's just don't do it.
In your book, I think you mentioned losing your compass at one point, and I was wondering, did you have an extra, or if you didn't, how did you function without it?
Great question. It was very hard, and we were pretty lost for the north part of Lake Winnipeg. We did not have a GIS system like you would have now. We were just working off of maps, and it was very foggy in the North Basin, and if you've read the book, we always thought we were at the Nelson River, and then days go by, and we're still not at the Nelson River. But once we were on the river, we kind of knew it was pretty straightforward to follow the current and to follow the turns and the bends and stuff. Yeah. It'd be a very different trip today. Yeah, sorry, I did that thing again.
Who won the cribbage games overall?
We actually stopped perfectly tied. That's the best question. And so I don't know if you can see all these tally marks. We played a lot of cribbage, and we decided, I think it was like 50-50, and we stopped. so we wouldn't get into a fight. We once didn't talk for several days after a chess game, so.
I have a question about how you managed the food. Like, did people do drop-offs for you at times, or how did you do that?
Great question. So I'll premise that with going through the program at Minogen, we were taught how to pack out food for expeditions, so like pounds per person per day, what types of food, all of those logistics. But for such a long trip, we had 3 major food drops. So we started, and then in the beginning, you're like hopping off at Dairy Queen and popping into a gas station and eating a pizza, so it gets a little weird. But we had a food drop in Fargo, Winnipeg, and Norway House for the larger dehydrated stuff, yeah.
What would you say are the most pessimistic factors on the waterways now, and what gives you optimism?
That's a great question. Oh, I mean, right, so I mentioned this, and, I have a lot of love for farmers. And this trip in particular taught me about the importance of listening, because it's very easy to villainize people when you're talking about water quality. I think what I'm pessimistic about is that we have created a system in which to grow corn and soybeans, you pollute the water, right? And so that's a very hard thing to figure out. But I'm hopeful because there are a lot of people who are working across the aisle, who are collaborating with farmers and conservation groups, and putting those buffer zones in, and putting different technologies in on the tiling system to hold water back sometimes and not. So right, we're working with what we have to make it a little bit better, and starting to think about, those farms that flood all the time, maybe they need to be wetlands. And this is a conversation that I'd love to have at a bar or something, because it's very complicated. But I do have a lot of hope, because there's a lot of policy and there's a lot of money going towards solving these problems. So that gives me hope. Cool. Well, I have held you all here for a very long time. I really appreciate you coming out, and I will be in the back signing books and just chatting a little bit longer. And again, thank you so much.
Okay. I'll just remind you all, thank you all for coming, by the way. This is wonderful. We do have the evaluation forms in back. We'll set up Natalie out there to do some book signing. Greg from Zambros is here if you haven't purchased a copy of the book and you would like to. Other than that, thank you again.